Let me just double check this. Okay. All right. So motivating operations, chapter 16. We've talked about motivating operations, particularly when we talked about reinforcement, but even in the beginning of the class, we discussed what motivating operations were. For those who are in ABA 510, we talked about them there as well. So, one of the things you'll notice about many of the courses is these basic principles will keep coming up over and over again. And the beauty of that is if you don't understand them initially, the more we work with them and the more we discuss them, you'll gain a better idea about the different concepts. So the history of motivating operations really comes from a term that's still used, and it's referred to as an establishing operation. So this was developed or really sort of formalized by a researcher by the name of Jack Michael in 1982. I think the term establishing operation originally came up in some of Skinner's writings, but in 1982, it sort of became an important concept within behavior analysis, and more specifically within applied behavior analysis, because as you'll see, it lends itself to some interventions, and it lends itself to certainly to understanding what motivates behavior more clearly. So establish an operation is a term that is still used, particularly when you're out there in practice. You may hear it used more than the contemporary term, which is motivating operation. So an establishing operation is simply any environmental variable that has two effects. The first one is it alters the effectiveness of some stimulus as a reinforcer, and as such, it alters the current frequency of all behavior that's been reinforced by that stimulus. So what does that mean? Well, if you consider the term establishing, it's specifically focusing on strengthening something as a reinforcer, right? So deprivation from food strengthens food as a reinforcer. If you just ate a big meal, food may not be reinforcing. If problem behavior is maintained by attention, the longer somebody goes without attention, it establishes attention as a stronger reinforcer. So this is not a static or a on-off type of thing. It's more of a continuum that the longer what we call the EO is in effect, the stronger the reinforcer is going to become, right? So the longer we go without food, the more powerful food is as a reinforcer. That second effect is important, the effect on behavior. So if the reinforcer effectiveness is increased, you're going to see more behavior that's been reinforced by that stimulus. So a couple ways to think about that is if we're utilizing reinforcement in practice, we always want our learners to be motivated, right? So the protocol that we just went over, or that we're going to go over, protocol 1 involved teaching a letter discrimination, and I said that you had to use some type of reinforcer. Folks used edible reinforcement. So if we have a potent reinforcer, meaning there's an EO in effect, you're going to see a lot of behavior to access that reinforcer. If the reinforcer is freely available and the individual consumes a lot of it, the value of the reinforcer is decreased, or the effectiveness is decreased, and you're going to see behavior decrease as well. So establishing operation was the initial terminology. And as I mentioned, that is still used pretty widely. In 2001, I believe it was a student of Jack Michael, a person by the name of Laraway, published an article along with Jack Michael where they expanded the concept of establishing operation, or they said a better term for this is motivating operation, because we want to account for not just the establishing operation. So in other words, we don't want to just account for events that increase the value of a reinforcer and increase the current frequency of behavior. We also want to include events that decrease the reinforcing effectiveness. And not that establishing operation didn't do that, but it didn't do it clearly. So the term that's in favor is motivating operation. And the reason for that is it accounts for what we might call an establishing operation effect and an abolishing operation. So let's look at that a little more clearly. So you could think of motivating operations as having two primary effects. The two effects are value altering. They either increase or decrease the effectiveness of a stimulus as a reinforcer. The second effect is a behavior altering effect. They either increase the current frequency of a behavior or they decrease the current frequency of the behavior. So these value altering and behavior altering effects are clearly linked together in that if an establishing operation is present, meaning the value of a stimulus as a reinforcer is present as well, or maybe it's strengthening, you're going to see a lot of behavior to gain access to that particular reinforcer. The abolishing operation is the opposite direction. If that is in effect, the value of a reinforcer is decreasing, and you're going to see a decrease in the current frequency of a behavior maintained by that stimulus. So there's a lot here in this term, but I hope that by the definition, it's reasonably clear kind of what's happening. So let's just think of a couple more applied examples. And I'm probably going to be recycling some of the same examples that I've gone over in the past. As behavior analysts, we do use a lot of reinforcement, right? Whenever we can, we want to shape up new behaviors or teach new behaviors. And we may use some form of reinforcement. In order for the reinforcer to be powerful or function as a reinforcer, we have to ensure that there is an establishing operation present. So again, kind of leaning on protocol 1, several folks used edible reinforcers in that protocol, things like Skittles or M&Ms. So when we're using those things in practice, one of the things we do to ensure that there's an establishing operation present is we restrict access to them during non-therapy times, right? So, so in other words, if the child's most preferred item that we've identified maybe during a preference assessment is M&Ms, we would tell mom and dad and perhaps other people, do not provide M&Ms. That ensures that when you show up to do your sessions, your teaching sessions or whatever you're doing, that there's an establishing operation, that the child's gone maybe 2 days without M&Ms. M&Ms are their favorite food. So therefore, when you show up, there's been an establishing operation, that they've been deprived. Obviously, you know, we're not talking about serious deprivation, but they've been deprived of M&Ms. So therefore, M&Ms are a strong reinforcer, and you're probably going to get, you know, for lack of a better example, you're going to get a lot of compliance or a lot of behavior, appropriate behavior to gain access to the M&M, right? So hopefully that makes sense. As opposed to if the parents did not follow your guidelines for whatever reason, maybe they just gave the child a large bag of M&Ms before you showed up, suddenly there's an abolishing operation in effect, right? If the child just consumed a large bag of M&Ms, that's going to decrease the value of M&Ms, the reinforcing value. And of course, you might not get as much behavior, right? The child will not be motivated to necessarily work. So I'm describing these sort of very, I guess, concrete examples, but I do want you to keep in mind that, one, these things are always ebbing and flowing, right? So sometimes the EO is strong, sometimes it's weakened and there's an abolishing operation. The other thing is, you know, I'm using these sort of, I guess, clinical examples where, you know, we're using edible reinforcement, but we also have to think about this sort of in everyday behavior, right? That we contact reinforcement, and if we contact a lot of it, it becomes weak. It lessens over time, right? If you went to like a raging party, which I'm sure we've all been deprived of at this point, you've probably gotten a lot of attention, a lot of social interaction. So, maybe the next day you kind of hang out by yourself and binge watch Netflix or something, because you've satiated on the reinforcer. So you're not going to seek out attention. Or maybe if you've been watched a TV show to sort of stay on that theme, maybe the next day you take a break from TV because you've satiated on that reinforcer. So your TV watching behavior decreases as well. Another way to think of this is in the context of problem behavior, and those in the 510 class probably remember these discussions. So those who did not have ABA 510, hopefully you have an idea that when we talk about problematic behavior that some of our clients may engage in, like aggression or maybe self-injury or disruptive behavior, those are also bound with these motivating operations, that the problem behaviors occur because they are reinforced, right? And they're reinforced in a variety of ways, but let's just talk about positive and negative reinforcement. So escape as a reinforcer, right? If escape is not a reinforcer if there's no aversive context, right? So we'll talk about more examples later, but if I do not like to do academic work and academic work is presented, then the EO is in effect. So escape becomes a valuable reinforcer. If there's no work in effect, escape is not a reinforcer, right? Similarly, if problem behavior is maintained by gaining access to adult attention, in the absence of adult attention, the EO is in effect. If adults are providing attention, there's an abolishing operation, right? Attention is not reinforcing. I'm not going to seek out attention if I'm already getting it, or I just had a lot of attention. So again, these things ebb and flow. The I guess more concrete behavioral examples are pretty clear. It's perhaps a little more difficult to think of these in your everyday life, but they do operate. Okay. A setting event. I wasn't going to put this in there, but it's in the textbook. So I just want to kind of describe it briefly. Let me go back. So in behavior analysis, when we discuss the things that we just went over, generally we're referring to them as motivating operations. Again, some people kind of stick with that term EO. So I think that's obviously important for all of you to know, not only for this class, but just to be a good behavior analyst. Sometimes when you get out there in the field, people have different perspectives on things. And one of those perspectives is known as a setting event. So instead of referencing motivating operations or an EO, some people talk about setting events. This is not the proper term, but again, it exists out there in the field. So I do think it's worth going over. So a setting event, as it's described, and this comes from the text, is a set of variables that may affect stimulus response relationships. So, it really is very similar to a motivating operation. So for example, a setting event might be sleep deprivation. If somebody is sleep deprived, they may be more susceptible to engage in certain problematic behaviors. And they're saying that that is a result of a setting event, that there's this event of sleep deprivation that sets up, we'll just loosely say problematic behavior later down the road. The reason it's similar to motivating operations is this. You could think of a lot of different things that might be setting events, right? When we talk about motivating operations, we kind of talk about deprivation versus satiation. Obviously, sleep deprivation is deprivation from sleep, which would increase sleep as a reinforcer. But a setting event doesn't really specify that. They just say, well, this thing happened that makes an individual, susceptible to problematic behavior. So for example, if a student came to your class or your therapy session and they were sleep deprived, escape might be a stronger reinforcer, right? Because they had this history of they're sleep deprived, suddenly they don't want to be participating in your class, right? So the reinforcer is still escape, but they're saying because there's a sleep deprivation, it was a setting event. Again, the text doesn't spend too much time on this, and I don't want to spend too much time on it, but motivating operation. It's a motivating operation. That's the best way to think of it. In fact, in behavior analysis, we do use the term motivating operation. Again, the reason I added this is I'm sure you will interact with somebody who will be like, well, identify the setting events. You might work with a behavior analyst who uses that term, but it's a motivating operation. Okay, so hopefully I didn't make things more confusing there. Okay, so let's dig into motivating operations and their effects a little more deeply. So when we're talking about the value altering effects, you really have these two primary events. One is deprivation, the other is satiation, and they are obviously at opposite ends of a continuum, but there's sort of flow between those two extremes. So if you think about motivating operation effects related to food, and that pizza looks delicious, deprivation would be the value altering effect, right? So if you've been deprived of a good pizza for some time, if you like pizza, the reinforcing value of pizza increases. And the behavior altering effect is going to be that pizza seeking behavior is going to increase, right? Whether that's something as specific as I'm going to pick up the phone and order a pizza, or I'm going to browse, online menus to find a good pizza. That's sort of the effect, right? That, hey, we haven't had pizza for a long time. I love pizza. Let's start engaging in behaviors to gain access to pizza. So that's sort of an everyday example. So again, the effects of deprivation on, in this case, increases the value of food as a reinforcer and increases the current frequency of behavior reinforced by food. Satiation is the opposite end of that continuum, right? So we're going to talk about decreasing values and behavior decreasing as a result. So if you've just had, in this example, a lot of pizza, the reinforcing value of pizza decreases. And the behavior altering, the behavior of seeking out the next slice is gone. It decreased because you've had enough pizza, right? So I'm obviously using an everyday example, but when we're analyzing behavior, the behavior of our clients, we have to consider these things. And I want to emphasize, when we're analyzing not only problematic behavior, but if there are skill deficits or things of that nature, we have to consider, is it a skill deficit because the skill is not present, it's never been taught, or it's not been taught effectively? Or is the skill there, but the person's not motivated to respond? If it's the latter, we need to start considering this stuff. Well, why are they not motivated to respond? And there could be a variety of reasons, but we could look at manipulating the motivating operations to bring about the change. Does anybody have questions at this point? Okay, let's keep going. So the MO effects related to food, that's sort of a common, easy example. It doesn't have to be food, though. It could be, obviously, drinks. There are primary reinforcers that all of us need, and there are motivating effects related to all of those. But there's also MO effects related to some of the reinforcers that we use in our practice, as mentioned. If it's an edible reinforcer, if we're using tokens, all of those things, there are motivating operation effects related to those. Another example to consider would be motivating effects related to painful stimulation. Now, that sounds pretty harsh, but I don't necessarily mean, and I have a little image of a needle there, I guess, because vaccines are on everybody's mind. I don't always mean painful stimulation. You could think of it as aversive stimulation. And there's a lot of examples of that. So we'll maybe talk about some examples shortly, but let's just look at this. So the MO effects related to painful stimulation are, again, value altering and behavior altering. So you could have an event, a painful stimulation, whether it's very short in duration or long period, that's going to increase the reinforcing effectiveness of pain reduction. And you could expand that pain reduction into a couple areas: escape from pain, simply reducing the pain, any of those things. So what we're talking about here is some event that increases the reinforcing effectiveness of reducing that pain. The behavior altering effect is going to increase the current frequency of all behaviors reinforced by pain reduction, right? So here we're talking about negative reinforcement. There's going to be behavior that results in reduction in the pain or escape from the pain. So again, I know I'm using painful stimulation here, but you could think of it as aversive stimulation. So I'm going to get you all back on the screen and we'll do a little example here. Okay, so everybody's back on the screen. So I'm going to pick on somebody here. So Jessica Camarda, what's a surrogate condition motivating operation?
Can you repeat that one more time?
What is a surrogate condition motivating operation without looking?
Motivation. Could you what do you mean by surrogate? Yeah.
It's in the chapter.
It's in the chapter.
We'll go to somebody else. Yeah. We'll go to somebody else. Jessica Jones.
I was actually reading this today and it actually kind of confused me. I'm like, I was kind of getting confused with this surrogate and transitive, the other ones. So I'm sorry, I can't really, I'm not going to look, but it kind of confused me as in, relating to motivating operation. And then it's like, oh, this is a surrogate.
So I didn't expect anybody to be able to answer that, but can I ask this? So Jessica, was that a little bit of an aversive situation?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is sort of the example, right? The classic example in every academic environment. I can remember being in grad school and a professor asked a particular student and it's silence, and it gets the longer that silence goes, it gets more uncomfortable, right? I don't particularly use those tactics. I know Dr. Perrin and I have talked about that at times. Sometimes I have, so it's, that points out an example that is common. You ask somebody a question and the silence is aversive, right? So that's increasing the value of escaping that silence as a reinforcer, right? And again, remembering to my grad school days, my advisor would ask one person and it would be painful for everybody because that person could, didn't know the answer, but he wouldn't let anybody else answer to relieve the aversive situation. So little example there. Okay, let's go back. I didn't want to really make anybody uncomfortable, but I think that sort of highlights what we're talking about. So you could see that when we talk about painful stimulation or aversive stimulation, it can take a lot of different forms. So much of what we discussed in ABA510 that relates to negatively reinforced behavior kind of relates to this, that for some children, when work is presented for whatever reason, they have learned to escape that work by engaging in problem behavior. So the reinforcer is escape. The MO effect, or we could look at the term EO here, is that when work is presented, the EO is present. And the longer that work is present, the stronger the EO becomes, right? So you get that value altering effect where work is presented, suddenly escape becomes a reinforcer. The longer work goes on, escape becomes a stronger reinforcer, and I'm going to start engaging in behavior to get out of doing work. Right, so that's our problem behavior example. Just to draw that out a little more, you could even consider, and we probably talked about this also in 510, that some of you may even work with children where you can observe this, that they could work for 5 minutes, but you can't get them to work for 10 minutes, right? Or maybe get them for 10 minutes, but you can't go 15 because they start engaging in disruptive behavior or they become distracted. You could think of that also as changes in a motivating operation, that the longer they are engaged in this sort of teaching arrangement, a little academic environment, the more powerful or the stronger escape from that situation becomes as a reinforcer. Again, it's like, I'm sure as many fun parties or family gatherings we've all been to, there have been those where it's like, I cannot wait to get out of here, right? So that is sort of the EO becomes stronger the longer you are there, and then you start to generate more behavior to get out of there. Or maybe you've gone with your significant other to a place where you'd rather not be, and the longer you're there, the stronger escape becomes as a reinforcer, so you start engaging in behavior to get out of the situation. Okay, so you get that the EO effect is the increase in the stimulation and then the behavior. You also have the opposite effect, a decrease. So there are things obviously that can decrease the reinforcing effectiveness of pain reduction, and that generally is pain reduction, right? So if the painful stimulation has disappeared, it will decrease pain reduction as a reinforcer, and you're not going to be seeking, engaging in behavior to reduce the pain. Okay, so both of these effects ebb and flow, as mentioned. You get the EO effect and the AO, the abolishing operation. Okay, this example comes out of the textbook. It is an example of motivating operation related to temperature changes, obviously very timely given it just snowed and it's pretty cold. I do want to point out that thus far we've been talking primarily about unconditioned motivating operations. So like some of the things we've discussed in the past related to unconditioned reinforcement and conditioned reinforcement, unconditioned punishment, conditioned punishment. Motivating operations have that same clarification. So we're talking about things that do not require learning to be motivating operations. They just sort of exist all the time. So, this little section from the book kind of points out it's uncomfortably cold. That would establish warmth as a reinforcer. Right, so it's an unconditioned motivating operation that when it is cold, warm becomes a reinforcer, and you're going to engage in behavior that has produced a warming effect in the past, whether it's adding a sweater or changing the thermostat. And you can see once that happens, things return to normal. Suddenly you're comfortable, right? So that being comfortable or homeostasis, whatever you want to call it, abolishes increase of warmth as a reinforcer, right? Once you're comfortable, you're not motivated to, produce more warming if you will. So that abates behavior that produces the warming effect. You could continue with this path. If it got uncomfortably warm, then being cooler or cold becomes the reinforcer, right? So it would evoke behavior like taking off the sweater or changing the thermostat, and then we return to normal and things start over. So temperature is a sort of a nice example of how these motivating operations ebb and flow, that it's not just sort of one or nothing, it's sort of a continuum. You could substitute this example, as mentioned, with some of the examples that we discussed with respect to treating children with problematic behavior, right? That when you're doing work, escape becomes a reinforcer. When there's no work, escape weakens as a reinforcer, behavior changes occur accordingly. So again, nice little example there. So again, thus far, unconditioned motivating operations, and we've talked about motivating operations essentially being these environmental events that have two effects. They change the value of something to function as a reinforcer and change the current frequency of behavior related to those reinforcers. Now, if you remember, we'll talk about discriminative stimuli more when we discuss stimulus control, but I think all of you probably know what a discriminative stimulus is. I guess I should ask. Somebody tell me what a discriminative stimulus is. I won't call on anybody this time.
Isn't that a stimulus where when it's presented, the subject knows the reinforcer that's going to be applied?
Essentially, yes. So we could talk about it in terms of a stimulus that signals the availability of reinforcement. And again, it's because of a behavioral history that a response occurred in the presence of a specific stimulus that resulted in reinforcement. So we could say that the stimulus signals the availability of reinforcement. Okay, now it's easy to confuse motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. They kind of seem very much the same, right? That an SD signals the availability of reinforcement, and therefore you see more behavior in the presence of the discriminative stimuli. Similarly, motivating operations, they don't signal the availability of reinforcement, but they make reinforcement perhaps stronger and then change behavior as a result of that. They are different, right? So motivating operations are related to the differential reinforcing effectiveness of a particular stimulus event, and that can change. So that stimulus can change from being very reinforcing to not being reinforcing at all, right? So a motivating operation just is referring to something functioning as a reinforcer or not. Of course, you have that behavioral effect as well, but discriminative stimuli are related to the differential availability of a reinforcer. That's sort of the key thing there, that an SD signals that reinforcement is available, right? An MO just changes the value of the reinforcer. So another way to sort of expand on this concept, or the differences in these two concepts, is that if, for example, let's just say, this was an example that I remember when I was in graduate school. Does anybody know Krispy Kreme donuts? Is that a thing? Yeah, I mean, it only existed in the South, but now I have one. There's like one close to the house, and I don't eat donuts a lot, but they would have this sign, right, that would say hot donuts available. And students used to ask, well, is that an SD or a motivating operation? And it's an SD because it's signaling that should you want donuts, they are available, right? The motivating operation is, your sort of current state. Do you want donuts or not? If the motivating operation was lower, like if I just had donuts for breakfast and I see the sign, it's still an SD, but I'm not motivated to respond to gain access to donuts, right? Does that make sense? Sort of a weird example, but one that I remember. So yeah, SDs just signal that reinforcement is available. Let's think of it in terms of a client with whom we're working. And let's just say, again, it's a problem behavior example. So if problem behavior is maintained by escape from a task, the SD might be the presence of the task. But if I just had an escape period or a break from work and I come back, that initial task, it's still an SD that if I engage in problem behavior, escape might be likely. But if I'm not motivated to respond, that SD is sort of ineffective. So they're two different concepts. The key thing to focus on would be that SDs signal the availability of reinforcement, right? Motivating operations don't signal the availability. They just, change the value of what's reinforcing. Okay. I'm not an artist, so I didn't spend time drawing this figure on a slide, but if you have the book in front of you, if not, it's fine. But if you look at the example on page 379, I'm actually going to look at it myself. Yeah, it's just another good example of motivating operations sort of in everyday life. I don't know if you have the book in front of you, but it's this section here. I would encourage you to spend time looking at it. I'll go over one portion of it, but it sort of gives the example of motivating operations in SDs related to having a headache and finding aspirin, right? So it starts out with, there's a motivating operation. You have a headache. Perhaps you just got through Dr. Perrin's class at the end, and now you have a headache. So that is the MO. That MO increases the value of aspirin as a reinforcer. The SD might be, where you keep the aspirin. Maybe it's in the bathroom, right? So bathroom is an SD. The behavior is you go into the bathroom, look for the aspirin, you find the aspirin, you consume, that is a reinforcer. No more headache, right? So the motivating operation has been abolished. If you consider that, so that's again highlighting this relationship between the MO of the headache and the SD. Now, in another context, another part of your house, perhaps you have the headache because you just finished Dr. Perrin's class. You're in the kitchen, there's no aspirin in the kitchen, right? So the kitchen is not an SD, but your headache is still there. So you want to look for aspirin. So you don't look in the kitchen because there's no aspirin there. Again, you go to the bathroom and you get your aspirin and life is good. So that figure, I think, is a nice explanation using a common behavior that you could probably all relate to in terms of motivating operations and discriminative stimuli. So that's why I put this slide in there. I think it illustrates that point. Okay, before we get into condition motivating operations, does anybody have questions?
I have a quick question about 2 slides ago for the
Okay.
painful stimulation. Which one would be like the scratching the itch? Because I see one that says negative reinforcement. Would that be the EO?
Yeah, so the itch could be the EO or the motivating operation, right? So you get this itch. You can consider it an aversive stimulation, right? Obviously, that's sort of rigid scientific ways of talking about these things, but essentially an itch is an aversive situation. The scratch, so it's going to increase behavior that produces the removal of the itch. So the removal of the itch is the reinforcer, right? And that is a negative reinforcement contingency. So honestly, there's probably a couple ways we could do that. Scratching the itch would be one way. So when we think of itching, increasing behaviors to eliminate the itch, it could be scratching, maybe have some topical ointment that relieves itching. So there are different behaviors that could eliminate the itch. But yes, that would be a perfect example.
Okay. I was just going to write a note next to it. So thank
Yep.
you.
Any other questions, comments? Okay. We're almost done with the motivating operation. So I think we're making good time here. Let me go back to sharing my screen. Okay. So as mentioned, thus far, we've been talking about unconditioned motivating operations. So the big difference there is no learning had to take place, no pairing of stimulus conditions occurred for those things to function as motivating operations. Again, kind of simply breaking it down to deprivation from some reinforcer or satiation on the reinforcer. So there's no learning that needs to occur. As with all things in behavior analysis and science, things get infinitely more complex. So there are what would be referred to as conditioned motivating operations. So these are events that occur that did not really have a value altering effect in an unconditioned fashion. They only do so because they've been paired with other unconditioned motivating operations. So one of the examples that is commonly used, and these things are really, these concepts can be difficult to understand and can be difficult to think of applied examples for. There's this first one I think makes a lot of sense. And there'll be one we talk about when we get to transitive condition motivating operations that is helpful for applied practice. So let's just focus on the definition. So these are going to be motivating operations that acquire the value altering and behavior altering effects due to pairing with unconditioned motivating operations. So it's based on a learning history. An example that's commonly used is a locked door, right, is a condition motivating operation that establishes gaining access to the key to unlock the door as a reinforcer, right? So when you think about it, if you break it down, keys are not reinforcers, right? I think we can all agree upon that. But when there is a locked door, suddenly finding the key becomes a reinforcer. If you kind of think of it in the current environment we're in, imagine you get home, if we were on campus or wherever you go, you get home late, it's dark, it is cold, your keys are buried somewhere. There's an unconditioned motivating operation because it's cold, but the condition motivating operation is, the key. You need to find the key because you want to get in to get warm. So the key is the reinforcer or unlocking the door is a reinforcer. Finding the key is the condition motivating operation. Does that make sense? So a key doesn't have a reinforcing value, but suddenly when you find the locked door, now you need the key. So there are a couple different examples of this that you could probably extend to your everyday life, but I think that this notion of the key is probably the most clear. So when we start to get into the other condition motivating operations, whoops, let me go forward. There are three of them. One is a surrogate condition motivating operation. The other one is reflexive. And the last one is transitive. I'm going to spend a little more time on the transitive CMO because it has the most application to applied practice. But all of these help us better understand what controls human behavior, the behavior of organisms. So I'm just going to go through them. And I think the text does a nice job of presenting more examples. The surrogate CMO, right? So this is we're talking about condition motivating operations. A surrogate CMO is a previously neutral stimulus that's acquired its motivating effects by being paired with an unconditioned motivating operation. Food deprivation is again, another example, right? So I think, again, the textbook kind of spells this out nicely, but all of us probably have this experience that obviously when we're deprived of food, an unconditioned motivating operation, gaining food is reinforcing. So if you're on the road, unconditioned motivating operation, you see a restaurant, there's access to food there. So you turn in and you go in, you order, all that good stuff. You do this enough, and then you have a pairing that occurs that being hungry and being in a restaurant are two stimulus events that become paired. So then this neutral stimulus, the restaurant, becomes a surrogate CMO, right? And some of you probably have had this experience where you're driving past, whatever your favorite place to get food is, and you're not really hungry, but you see the place and it's like, oh, I could go for a slice of pizza, or I'd go for Mexican food right now, even though you weren't initially motivated to do so. It is because there is a conditioning effect that has occurred. Does that make sense? Right? So it is the pairing that occurs is, let's just speak casually and say you've been in enough situations where you've been hungry and you've gone to a restaurant to get food. The restaurant doesn't, produce a motivating operation. It's just a place to get food. But because you've been hungry in restaurants many times, sometimes the restaurant sort of evokes a motivating operation, just seeing it like, oh, I could really go for, pizza right now, even though I just ate something. So that's sort of an example there. Another example that comes from the applied literature is something referred to as diverted attention or divided attention. Some of you who were in the ABA510 class may remember a discussion about this related to a functional analysis condition. For those who are not in that class, I think you'll be able to resonate with this example, particularly if you work with kids or you've been around kids for some time. Diverted attention. So sometimes attention is a reinforcer, right? And if I've been deprived of attention, it becomes a stronger reinforcer. I engage in behavior to get attention. So that is an unconditioned motivating operation. There are some situations that ends up being paired with, and that would be situations in which we'll use parents. The parents are suddenly providing attention to somebody else, right? So even though mom and dad just gave me a lot of attention, the fact that they've now diverted their attention to my sister, now I'm motivated to get their attention, right? Has anybody sort of seen examples like that or considered examples where, particularly for children, but I guess, if you're in a dating scene, perhaps that's an example too, where your interest provides attention to somebody else. Suddenly you now are motivated to get their attention back. So that would be a surrogate condition motivating operation, right? So we're talking about two events being paired, something that is an unconditioned motivating operation paired with some other stimulus event, like the presence of a restaurant, or the person you want attention from giving attention to somebody else. Does that make sense? A little bit of a difficult example to digest, but this divided attention example exists in the applied realm. Sometimes when we're analyzing a child's problem behavior, we may see that it's not specifically reinforced by or evoked by attention, but it's evoked when the parent or caregiver provides attention to somebody else. Then that motivating operation is established. This one's even probably a little more difficult to comprehend. So a reflexive CMO, again, is any stimulus that precedes the onset of another stimulus event. But in this case, we're talking about painful stimulation or aversive stimulation, right? So it's an event that precedes the onset of, I'm going to say, aversive stimulation, becomes a condition motivating operation or a reflexive CMO, in that its own offset functions as the reinforcer. So I actually did just give this example when I asked Jessica, for the definition of a surrogate CMO, which now you know. So I won't ask you again, but you could see by this little graphical example here, what we're talking about is that so the absence of instruction is not really a motivating operation in and of itself. But when you get this sort of sequence of things, it can become conditioned to be a motivating operation. So follow me as I go through this. Person provides an instruction. The individual can comply with that instruction, which eliminates the instruction, right? So we'll use a classic example that I give. So I ask one of you a difficult question. You answer it, the question goes away. The other way to think of it is the question is sort of aversive stimulation, right? So you answer it, the aversive stimulation goes away. The other path would be, I ask a difficult question, student doesn't know the answer, suddenly there's more aversive stimulation, right? There's quiet, nobody's talking, it gets uncomfortable. So there's a lot of aversive stimulation, which again strengthens the removal of this instruction as a reinforcer, right? So it's sort of this reflexive thing that in an instructional sequence, for example, this event, the offset of this event functions as the reinforcer. Okay, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. I'm trying to think of another example. You may remember from ABA511, Dr. Perrin talking about something known as either one factor or two factor theory of avoidance. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Well, I'll talk about it a little more broadly. So there are these basic behavior analytic procedures where they study avoidance behavior in animals like rats. And the arrangement would go like this. The rat is in the operant chamber and they can engage in a response like a lever press to escape an aversive situation. So what they do is, I'm not in favor of this stuff, but they shock the grid, right? They electrify the grid and suddenly it's aversive. The rat gets shocked. Then they start to precede the shock with a tone, right? Tone goes on for a little bit, then the shock comes. The rat can, when the tone comes on, the rat can actually hit the lever to turn off the tone, which eliminates the shock, right? So that's sort of an example like this, where the removal of this aversive stimulation is the reinforcer. Okay, last thing we're going to cover with these sort of more complex motivating operations is what's called the transitive condition motivating operation. So a transitive CMO is when an environmental event that establishes the effectiveness of another event or reinforcer has been manipulated in some way. So the textbook talks about this procedure called an interrupted chain procedure. So let me sort of talk about this a little more loosely. So when we're teaching our clients, for example, how to use language like ask questions or ask for their favorite toys, sometimes we use the actual object as a reinforcer, right? So a child likes M&Ms. We hold up an M&M. When they say M&M, please, we give them the M&M, right? We use their favorite toy. We hold it up. When they say toy, please, we provide the toy. So those are very specific, discrete stimulus reinforcer events. But how do we generate more communication when we can't always provide their favorite item, right? So in the absence of their favorite toy, how can we motivate them to communicate for other things or make additional communication responses? And one way to do that is to use what's called an interrupted chain procedure. So the way this would sort of lay out is we could get the child's favorite toy, right? So we know that we can motivate them to say, toy, please, to gain access to the toy. If we wanted to create a chain that we interrupt, we could place their favorite toy somewhere else. We could hide it, for example. And that would create a transitive CMO that they have to say, where is the toy, to gain access to the toy. So they're not just saying toy, please, but they would say, where is a toy? Some researchers have done really interesting variations of this where they've motivated or taught children to ask for help to find their favorite item. So similar example, that you have the favorite toy, you hide the toy, the child has to go to another therapist and say, excuse me, where is my toy? So now they're engaging in more behavior than they would if you were just using a single reinforcer. Does that make sense? The reason I have this sort of picture of the peanut butter and jelly is that's another example, right? So imagine you're teaching the individual to communicate for peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and they say peanut butter and jelly, and you make the sandwich, and that's great, or you have them make it. One way we could expand their communication or keep their motivation high would be to only provide one ingredient at a time, right? So first they have to request the bread. Bread, please, great job, here's the bread. Then they have to request the peanut butter. Then they have to request the jelly. So instead of having this one instance where they say peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and you provide them everything, we're sort of making these little interruptions where now they have to ask. You could expand that to using puzzle pieces, right? They have to request each puzzle piece, or you leave one puzzle piece out, right? Maybe they like building puzzles. And they could do so independently, but you leave one out. So it creates a motivating operation where now they're going to ask you, where's the puzzle piece, right? Does that make sense? So this is really comes in very useful, particularly for teaching language to children with autism, right? Because sometimes it's hard to find reinforcers to motivate additional pieces of language, but this sort of allows us to do that. Okay, so let's wrap up this section at least with some of the applied implications with respect to our understanding of motivating operations. So again, it is a very important concept. We will talk about ways to manipulate motivating operations to address challenging behavior, but understanding these plays a role in understanding how reinforcers work, right? So having this knowledge that reinforcer value changes leads us to say, well, hey, when we're using reinforcers, we should be doing things to prevent satiation, right? And that might involve restricting the reinforcers outside of your session time or your appointment time, or like we talked about last week, thinning the schedule reinforcement, right? If we're using edible reinforcement, we know there's a risk of satiation. So, we certainly want to move to limiting or thinning the schedule reinforcement when we can. We also know that we could increase the value of a reinforcer by withholding it for some time. So that gives us, a lot to work with in the applied realm. Treatment of challenging behaviors, we will talk about this in more detail later. The 510 students should know non-contingent reinforcement, non-contingent attention. So these are actual interventions that are centered on eliminating the motivating operation, right? So if a student engages in problem behavior to access a reinforcer, one way to address the problem behavior would be to decrease the value of the reinforcer. And the way to do that is to deliver it freely. So we'll talk about that. Decreasing aversive properties of stimuli, right? So going back to the discussion of motivating operations related to aversive conditions, if we think of, again, with respect to challenging behavior, if we think of escape as a reinforcer, or escape from work as a reinforcer, it must be that the work is aversive in some aspects. So how can we decrease the aversive properties of the work to decrease the motivation to gain escape? So again, you don't have to know these concepts for this section, but we will talk about these things. And then the last thing is it certainly has implications for skill acquisition programs. Certainly that preventing satiation is important, right? If we're using reinforcers to teach new behavior, we need to prevent satiation. But as we just discussed, we could contrive motivating operations where motivation is not present. We could create situations to establish the motivating operation, right? So as mentioned, instead of just giving the child his or her favorite toy, we can do something where it's hidden, or they have to go through a couple steps to gain access to it. Another thing, this was published in a couple articles. If it's a battery operated toy that the child prefers, you take the batteries out, right? So then you have a situation where the child has to request the toy. They get it, they try to turn it on, it doesn't work. So then they have to request batteries, or they have to request help, and then you provide the batteries. Okay, so I think that also is a nice, simple example. All right. Any questions or comments